A little while back, I had an idea. Let's send HI's outside correspondent Amy to every federal property in the United States. So, armed with this 312,579 row spreadsheet, she hit the streets. But once she'd visited this warehouse in Brooklyn, this bathroom in northern Wisconsin, this Army Medical Recruitment Center, and this unrelated hot dog shop near the Army Medical Recruitment Center, we realized we had a problem. You can't visit every federal property in the United States because nobody, not even the federal government, knows how many properties they have. Yep, that's right. America's biggest landlord has no clue how much land it lords, or what to do with it all. The US government manages about 28% of the total land area of the country. It's a mind-boggling amount of space. For context, this rectangle is the size of a giraffe riding an elephant, which I think we can all agree is pretty big. And this is the land owned by the US government. And on that land, there are over 1 billion square feet of real estate across anywhere from 120 to 400,000 buildings, but nobody knows exactly how many because it turns out keeping track of that is super complicated, and the government wasn't even trying to do it until 2004. That's the year President Dodgeball signed this executive order demanding the government identify and categorize all the property they own, lease, or otherwise manage, which was collected into a database called the Federal Real Property Profile that, in theory, lists every government building's age, condition, repair needs, maintenance costs, lease payments, proceeds from disposal, and number of employees. But every executive branch agency sent in their data however they felt like, which made the data pretty bad. The Coast Guard once reported that nearly 80% of their buildings needed absolutely no repairs, then later admitted that they hadn't checked and expected they'd find a lot once they did. And while something like age is pretty standard, as long as you don't use dog years, the VA and NPS, for example, use different standards to label a building in use, rendering that usefulness data, ironically, useless across the dataset. Here's the issue. The government is trying to produce centralized data from a decentralized system. The General Services Administration manages the property and also owns it, but has no real say in what goes on there. Then the Government Accountability Office is in charge of finding and getting rid of excess property, which is also the GSA's job, kind of, but not totally. Then there's the Office of Management and Budget dealing with the maintenance budget. Then, of course, there's the executive branch agencies, the ones who actually decide what happens in their own buildings. All this system complexity makes for wildly inconsistent and incomplete data. Fun fact, 77% of the buildings in the dataset as of 2020 didn't even have addresses listed. And the GSA, who collects all this data, can't make it better. They can question the agency's data, but ultimately, those agencies decide how much to report, what format to report in, and whether to call it accurate. So thanks to bad data, the government doesn't know exactly how vast or how usable their real estate inventory is. And while having too much real estate is such an outlandish concept to us cool youngs that it's hard to imagine it as a problem, it's a big one for the feds. They have unknown amounts of junk property and no good way to get rid of it. In 2015, agencies reported about 7,000 empty or underutilized buildings, and recent estimates have it at 10 times that. And a lot of that property is in rough shape, like this cabin in Tennessee whose roof is mostly whole, or this DC building that looks like it lost a game of mold paintball. And selling off or demolishing these properties is a massive headache. Let's imagine that the USDA owns an abandoned, ghost-riddled farmhouse in nowhere, Nebraska. In order for the GSA to sell it, the USDA first needs to report that it's an excess property. Then they have to make sure there's no asbestos or other poisons in there. Then they have to make sure it's environmentally safe. Then they have to offer it to the state and local government. Then they need to offer it to nonprofits. Then they need to see if it would work as a homeless shelter. If they do all that, i.e. turn their pastoral prison for lost souls into a non-toxic eco-haven that no government or nonprofit wants and that can't possibly shelter the unhoused, only then can the GSA sell it, at which point the money would most likely go to the Treasury instead of the USDA. And while no step in that process is particularly objectionable on moral grounds, what do you think most agencies do? Jump through all the hoops? Or not report the house as excess, lock the door, and forget about it? This all results in the federal government holding on to tons of buildings they don't need, and taxpayers footing the bill for yearly upkeep. Mowing lawns, keeping the power on, putting up security fences, all to the tune of about $1.7 billion a year. In 2016, Obama tried to fix this by signing the Federal Asset Sales and Transfer Act, intended to help the government identify, recommend, and offload excess properties by creating yet another agency, the Public Buildings Reform Board. And if you're thinking, it seems like adding another organization here to the mix might actually overcomplicate things, congrats on being right. The board tried to pick properties to sell, but the GAO didn't like their documentation, the GSA ignored their recommendations, and they got sued, among other things, for recommending the government sell off a tribal records building in Seattle. As of 2021, FASTA has brought a grand total of 8 properties to auction on the GSA website, the same place that, at the time of writing, you could bid on one of these 2 lighthouses or one of 17 Hyundai Sonatas. And yes, okay, sure, it's not ideal that the US government has as much trouble getting rid of their real estate as they do keeping track of it, and that the problem doesn't seem like it'll be solved anytime soon. But I'm holding on to one remaining hope, that I won't care about these problems anymore once I own a lighthouse. Okay, so I don't own a lighthouse, but you know what I do own, along with a few of your favorite creators? This video's sponsor, Nebula. Myself and other creators got together a few years ago as we wanted to make a streaming service with a business model that could support us making big, ambitious dream projects, and it worked out pretty well. Over 600,000 of you have signed up to watch things like Night of the Coconut, which is a feature-length film by Patrick Willems about an interdimensional genocidal coconut, which is pretty tough to describe, but I don't know anyone who's watched it and not found it amazing. There are also things like Lindsay Ellis's 45-minute deep dive into how he came to love Guy Fieri, our Crime Spree series, which was the precursor to Jetlag, and hours more of amazing content that answers the question, what could my favorite YouTuber do with a bigger budget? So if any of that interests you, or if you're just looking for the best possible way to support HAI and all the people who make it, sign up for Nebula right now. If you go to nebula.tv/HAI, you'll even get 40% off an annual plan, which brings the monthly cost down to under $3 a month.